Shavuot Tov. I've got kind of a complicated thesis to share that is about Yaakov when he's wrestling with this angel or mysterious character at Yabok, and also about the Teraphim that Rachel stole from the house of her father Lavan, and how this relates to the prohibition of eating the Gid HaNasheh, the sciatic nerve. And I think it may end up being two different shiurim, but I'd like to start by just trying to lay out some of the questions and look at some of the evidence, and then ultimately probably we'll have a second shiur that's more focused on the question of what might be the identity of this individual that Yaakov is wrestling with. But to start with, I think there's a few basic things we can ask. One is, what are Teraphim? So Teraphim are these objects that are stolen from the house of Lavan by Rachel Imenu. So when Yaakov and Leah and Rachel and all of their family are escaping from the house of Lavan, Rachel takes the Teraphim of her father, but we don't really know what Teraphim are from the text itself. It says, "Lavan alach ligzoz et tzono, v'tignov Rachel et hatrafim asher le'aviha." And Lavan went to shear his sheep, and Rachel stole the Teraphim that were her father's. And, when you read it, usually the translation is just Teraphim, because we don't really have, from the text in Chumash itself, what are Teraphim for. We know indirectly that when Lavan comes to accuse, he says, why have you stolen my gods? He uses the word Elohai. And so from that context, we know that they're idols in some way, or they're involved in Avodah Zarah. But exactly what they are and what they're used for and why Rachel would steal them, that's a thing we have to work on a bit. And we can get that out of the text with a bit of effort. But I think that's one question that's interesting. How do we understand from Chumash itself? We can also get help from the rest of Tanakh, but even from Chumash itself, what might Teraphim be? And why that matters. So that's one question. Another question is why it is that we don't eat the Gid HaNasheh, the sciatic nerve of kosher animals. And in one sense, there's a clear answer to that question, because the Torah says why we don't eat the Gid HaNasheh. It's because Yaakov, shortly after Rachel stole the Teraphim, after their encounter with Lavan, where he catches up with them in Galaed, then there's this mysterious event where Yaakov is wrestling and he injures the kaf yerich of his body, which is like somehow the socket of the thigh, or however it's translated. And so as a result, it says, Al ken lo yichlu v'nei Yisrael et gid hanasheh, asher al kaf hayerech ad hayom hazeh, ki naga'a b'kaf yerech Yaakov b'gid hanasheh. So the people of Israel do not eat the sinew of the vein, which is in the hollow of the thigh, so the sciatic nerve, basically, to this day, because he touched the hollow of Jacob's thigh and the sinew of the vein, or the sciatic nerve. And we know that in that sense, this is the reason given by the Torah for why we don't eat that part of a kosher animal. But that's not really a reason, in the sense that we don't have that as a general mechanism for where prohibitions come from in the Torah. This is the only instance where the Torah, as narrator, adopts that tone of saying, this story in the life of one of the Avot ended this way, and because of that, that's why we don't eat the Gid HaNasheh, as though it's obvious that it should become that way. We don't have these sort of just so stories from mitzvot in general, where it's like, and then Avram Avinu tripped over an iguana, and that's why we don't allow iguanas in our home, or it doesn't play out that way in multiple instances. There are places where it comes closest, where there are mitzvot where you can recognize a resonance or a parallel with the lives of the Avot. Things like not marrying two sisters, or not setting the son of your favorite wife ahead of some other son of a despised wife that you want to disinherit, where that clearly is connected with the politics of the family of Yaakov Avinu, but it doesn't strike a narrative comment out of the text and say, that's why we do this at this moment when we're reading it in Bereshit. It just, we have mitzvot elsewhere that we recognize are kind of referent back to the stories of Bereshit. But this is where in Bereshit, many cases we talk about the first mitzvah given in the Torah is the setting of the month in Sefer Shmot. But really, this is kind of the first mitzvah in another sense being given in the Torah. And it's a very peculiar one that seems to have no explanation. So I think another kind of question we can ask is, why do we not eat this thing? And what is it about? What kind of a prohibition is it? And there may be a chance to work on that and understand that issue a bit better. And then lastly, and this I think we won't get to in this shiur, I think there's an interesting question of who might this person be, if it's a man, that Yaakov is wrestling with in Yabok. People have argued, and I have argued previously, and it's possible to argue that it's Esav. There are commentators who say something more oblique, like it is the Sar of the Sar of Malachim for Esav, like it's some kind of heavenly emanation of, or protector of, or representative of the line of Esav. So there's some notion of it's about Esav, but maybe it's not exactly Esav himself. But if it's not Esav, which in a way, as much as you could argue, from the text, certain things are hinting that it's connecting with Esav, at the end of the day, he goes and meets Esav right afterwards. So it's kind of strange to imagine that they wrestle and there's all of this kind of ambiguity of identity. And then right afterwards, it's like, oh, hi, good to see you again. But let's pretend that we didn't just wrestle each other, unless it was in the dark. But even then, it's kind of... So, is there something else we can do with that? And I think there is. I think there's an interesting possibility there that takes a little work. But we probably won't get to that part today. And I think before that, we need to build up to it. And what will help is talking about these two other questions. What are the Teraphim, and why do we not eat the Gid Hanasheh? And I guess it makes sense to start with the Teraphim first, which is just, we have a clear idea that these things are idols. They have to do with Avodah Zarah, with forbidden foreign worship. And Rachel takes them, and there's something very disturbing about that, because we like to think of the Avot and Imahot as being righteous and correct in their behavior, that they struggle with the human condition, and then certainly when they deal with each other and the contradictions of life, they make mistakes. But this seems like a pretty glaring one, unless Rachel herself is, in a sense, an idolater. And that would be a disturbing notion. Now, it's true in general that her lineage, Bnei Rachel, we look at Yosef and Binyamin, that line succeeds more in diaspora, speaks the languages of foreign nations better, and also maybe is more of a penchant for foreign gods. So in that sense, that at least there's a slippery slope there that's being identified. But something as brazen as just, Rachel, she doesn't follow Hashem, she follows some other false gods. To imagine that Yaakov Avinu would be so desperate to marry her and to build a family with her, and even once he gets involved with Leah, he's always kind of trying to fight his way back to focusing on Rachel. For Yaakov to take that attitude just because she's beautiful and he's in love with her kind of romantically, despite the fact that she herself is kind of a Jezebel character, that doesn't really work. It doesn't make sense. It has to be something where we give Yaakov more the benefit of the doubt, where we give Rachel herself more the benefit of the doubt. And then you could say, okay, so then why did she steal the Teraphim? What would be the point of that? And I think there are various speculations you could make right off the bat. First of all, idols were sometimes made of gold and silver. And so it could have been one of these mistakes of, she felt that there were wages owed to Yaakov. so to speak, that they had to leave with. This is a kind of a Yitziat Mitzrayim in miniature. They're leaving bondage and going back to the land in the way that eventually Bnei Yisrael will do in Mitzrayim. So they're leaving servitude to Lavan, and maybe this is the gold and silver that you're supposed to leave with in the manner of Mitzrayim. But of course, there's a problem with it. They're idols, so they're not just gold and silver, and deriving benefit from idols is a problem, even if they have some kind of monetary value. And so one has to treat that issue carefully. So you could say that she's kind of making that sort of mistake. She just wanted the money, so to speak, and maybe they were owed the money, but it's still a problem for her to take idols. That's one possibility. Another one, more subtly, is that we tend to think in terms, because Tanakh gives us those bright lines to work with, of these are idols and these are tools. And tools are fine, useful, use them, no problem. Idols, however, are totally forbidden, and they also don't work because idolatry leads down a false path. And so you look at these characters in Tanakh, and it's always kind of like, why are you doing this? Why are you doing idolatry? It's so stupid. It will only lead you to ruin, and there's no truth in it, and you're doing it even though it's forbidden. So it must be some kind of inability to control the temptation of something that you have such a craving to do, even though it's forbidden to you. And it kind of comes across that way. And maybe there are aspects of idolatry that are like that, both in the sense that it's useless and in the sense that one craves the fantasy of it being useful. There is something very attractive about the idea of being able to control the gods and make them do what you want. And maybe some people just desire so much to believe they have that power that they're willing to put credence in something that is just nonsense, right? But I think that you could give people more credit and say there may be a lot of situations where idolatry is more tangled up in technology. So taking a modern example, a very present and current day example, something like one of these large language models, ChatGPT or Grok or whatever, clearly there are some people who will take that as a tool and say, oh, I can use this to find scientific papers of very precise topics that I'm interested in, and that will help me to do my job. And I'm a researcher, and so it's a great tool for that. Someone else might come along and say, I believe, first of all, that there's so much knowledge contained in this artificial intelligence model that it knows more than I do about what I should do. Second of all, I want companionship. And so I'm going to just talk to it like it's a god and I'm trying to fulfill its will, right? You could do that. There probably are already people basically doing that with these technologies. And so the same technology for one person is a tool, and for another person has been made into a god. And clearly making it into a god is a problem, but that's more of an issue of your relationship to the thing. It's not an issue like intrinsic in the thing itself. And so if you view it in those terms, then you could say, okay, so maybe for Lavan, this thing that Rachel stole had there was a problematic status that it had in his eyes. But for her, it was some kind of tool, and we haven't been told what the tool does, although we can maybe guess soon. But there might have been some kind of legitimate reason for Rachel to bring it, right? A long time ago, I think it was when I was a postdoc, I was at an art exhibit, an exhibit in an art museum. I think it was at Princeton University, where it was all of these tools made by Inuits or Eskimo type people, maybe in Alaska, Aleutian Islands people, these kind of Arctic native peoples, where they made like bucket handles and spear points and all these different tools. But every tool they made was also an idol, right? Where they carved gods or spirits or animal, kind of beings, demons, whatever, into the bucket handle, so that when you're using the bucket handle, you're not just using a bucket handle, you're calling upon the power of whatever god it is who's supposed to make your bucket stay on, and bringing the idea of gods into the very mundane it sounds like a different thing than what we sometimes imagine with deity. But I think the point is that at that kind of a point of intersection, if I don't have any other bucket handles and I need a bucket handle, maybe it'll be very hard to resist the temptation to take with me this bucket handle that has some God carved into it and try to use it, right? Um, and and so there are these kind of knife's edge situations where someone who's well-meaning feels like they're backed into a corner and they need this thing, and it has a clear use. And to them, it's not about calling on the gods, but on the other hand, to someone else, it will look like you've stolen my idols, you've stolen my gods. So there could be a situation like that going on with the Teraphim. And then lastly, most uh, subtly perhaps, or disturbingly perhaps, there may be things that look like idolatry as a practice that almost are indistinguishable from other things that, from the standpoint of Tanakh, in a certain story about a certain character, they seem like they're more kasher. So I'll give an example that's relevant to what we'll say about the Teraphim. So the ephod that David has, Evyatar Kohen, I believe it is, um, help him to like make decisions by inquiring of Hakadosh Baruch Hu, should I go to war or not? Should I chase the Amalkim or not? You know, those kinds of questions that David wants to bring to Hashem. When the Kohen is using the ephod, which maybe is like, you know, looking at how light scatters through the gemstones and the Chosh and Mishpat, it's not totally clear exactly, you know, what it was to use the ephod, but supposing that the Kohen has some method for some kind of getting an answer from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, what is it that makes that practice kasher, whereas going to a witch and having her roll some dice or throw some bones so that you can decide what to do that will bring you good luck, why is that forbidden and terrible, that kind of nichush, that kind of augury, whereas doing something with the Kohen, with the ephod, if David HaMelech does it, then it seems like, okay, that's kasher, there's no problem. Like, what's the difference? So that's the other thing that we have to ask about the Teraphim that Rachel brought is, was there something that you could do with them that, you know, is okay? Even if it is kind of, I'm saying, not just a tool, but if it starts to sort of bleed over into being something like a tool of divination or a method of divination. So I'm sort of showing my hand of where we're going, like what are the Teraphim? So they seem to be for divination somehow. And where do we know this from? How do we derive that? Well, the easiest thing is to look in the rest of Tanakh, because really, in some sense, if you look at Nach, meaning not the 5 books of Moses, but what comes afterwards, there are many instances where even when you're talking about books of major prophets, or, you know, not just even going to the end of Tanakh, but all the way through, it's almost like the Navi in his Nivuah, in his prophecy, he's giving an interpretation to something he's seeing in Chumash and making it clearer to you. So whether in Sefer Shoftim, for example, where Teraphim are mentioned, so we have in the time of Pesach Micha, V'haish Micha lo beit Elohim v'yas ephod u'terafim v'yamale et yad ahad mibanav v'yehilo lechohen. The man Micha had a house of gods and made an ephod and teraphim and consecrated one of his sons who became his priest. So already we just have the idea of ephod and teraphim together. So the ephod is the word that's used when David is inquiring of Hashem sometimes, but here the ephod is connected with the idea of teraphim. So that sounds like, okay, you use this for divination. That story is also about how making these gods was very costly. There was, you know, a lot of silver that went to the silversmith to make the Pesel Micha. So it's showing you with Rachel maybe both this issue of wealth and maybe also this issue of, you know, divination, decision making. that could be coming into play. Also, Teraphim are mentioned not only in the places I will mention. I haven't thought, for example, about exactly what it means, but they pop up with Michal and David, other than the fact that Michal is descended from Rachel, because she's from Shevet Binyamin, and so we're seeing how Binyamin has Teraphim lying around somehow. Like there's something more idolatrous about the household of a Benjaminite king than maybe David would want to be on his own. But when we look in Sefer Yechezkel, this is, I think, a very relevant source. Yechezkel is describing the king of Bavel, the king of Babylon, trying to decide which way to go to Yerushalayim to attack it. It says, Ki amad melech Bavel el em haderech berosh shnei hadrachim likasam kasem kilkal behitzim she'al betrafim ra'a b'kaved. The king of Babylon stood at the parting of the way, Ema Derech, the fork in the road, at the head of two ways, to use divination. He shook the arrows, he consulted the Teraphim, he looked at the liver, he's like reading entrails. So, in other words, when you're trying to make a good decision, you're going to use Teraphim as part of that. It's part of the kissim, it's part of the magic. And it's all about, let me consult the demons and spirits and gods and have them guide me towards success and good luck. So one way of approaching this is just to say, well, Yechezkel is a Navi. He told us what Teraphim are for, so we didn't get it from Chumash. We got it from Yechezkel, and now we know. And now we can go back to Chumash and read it more clearly. But I think that you could argue, actually, in many cases when the Navi does this, it's really already a Perush of Chumash. Like he's reading 5 books of Moses and he's getting something there, and he doesn't lay that all out, but part of how he's able to clarify to you what Teraphim are for is that really it's already there in Chumash. So let's try to work for it a little bit and see how do we get it from Chumash. And why would Teraphim be associated particularly with some idea of not just doing Avodah Zarah Stam, like any kind of foreign worship, or not just having an idol worshiping foreign gods, or not even trying to do magic of some kind. It's specifically about magic for better decision making, maybe even for like travel decisions, right? Like you're going on a journey. And there's if you just want to read Yechezkel alongside what happens with Rachel, that already fits together very neatly, because you have, on the one hand, the idea of Em Haderech, which literally means the mother of the way. So it's referring to motherhood, interestingly, and it's referring to the idea of a derech, a way, and there's a parting of the ways, and you have to decide which way to go. So it's sort of like, I want a GPS. I want to know what path I should take to get from A to B. Now, why is all that relevant? Well, with the Teraphim of Rachel, she takes the Teraphim and then she sets out on a journey with Yaakov. And ultimately, when she dies, she is on her way to somewhere, right? She dies in a place called Efrat, but it is on the way to Bethlehem. So it says, actually, this isn't when it first describes her death, but this is Yaakov reprising that description. U'ani bevoi mipadan meta alai Rachel be'eretz Canaan baderech be'od kivrat eretz lavo Efrata u'ekbereha sham bederech Efrat hi Bethlehem. So, and as for me, when I came from Padan, Rachel died by me in the land of Canaan on the way, when there was but little way to come to Efrat, and I buried her there in the way of Efrat, which is Bethlehem. So there's this multiple mentions of Derech, the way. She died how? She died giving birth to Binyamin, so she died in motherhood, and she dies on the way to somewhere, which is Bethlehem, which is significant because Bethlehem is where David, the king, will be born. But she gives birth to Binyamin, who is the progenitor of Shaul, the first king of Israel. So there's all this stuff about like Rachel at some level is like trying to get to kingship. She's trying to give Yaakov the son that he wants. She's trying to produce the kingly line of the Israelite nation. And in one sense, she succeeds because Shaul comes from Binyamin. And it even shows that in a sense she had the right idea. She was on the way to Bethlehem, but she didn't quite make it there. She dies in Ephrat, and Ephrat, which is right next to Bethlehem, Ephrat, interestingly, has the same letters as Teraf, like Teraphim, Pei Reish Taf versus Taf Reish Pei. So there's this sense in which it's like she dies in Ephrat, perhaps because she tried to use Teraphim to get where she was going. She doesn't make it all the way there. There's something kind of tragic about it, right? Where she maybe thought that she needed the Teraphim to get where she was going, but maybe she died because she took the Teraphim, and there was some kind of unavoidable sin. Yaakov declares whoever took these gods, should die when Lavan is searching, and so there's a sense in which he inadvertently sentences Rachel to death. And it's even the case that when she, is being searched, she turns Lavan aside by telling a fib, or at least maybe it's not actually a fib, but using the idea of Taharat Mishpacha, that she talks about being in a state of menstruation, and therefore she can't get up from her couch or her pillow, and really she's hidden the Teraphim underneath herself. And so she's using something to do with her feminine reproduction, and then she ultimately dies in childbirth. And it's in this place that has a name that's connected with Teraphim, and it's on a way, it's on a derech, she's trying to get somewhere. So there's a whole reading where you just take Yechezkel for granted, and you say, Rachel wanted to take the GPS that belonged to her father for their journey, because they were going on a dangerous, long journey, and they needed to figure out where to go. And maybe she was already pregnant. Maybe she was very worried about being successful in producing that son for Yaakov. She's always anxious about producing children because it's so difficult for her. You could also say maybe she thought the Teraphim were not a GPS, but they were some kind of thing that was supposed to help with childbirth, right? And again, I don't want to make this binary and turn it into lucky charms, like that she wanted a lucky amulet, and we know that lucky amulets are just lies and nonsense, and she shouldn't have taken it because it was just pagan sorcery, and it was a sin, and it was a grievous error, and it wouldn't have helped her anyway. I think we can read it that way. That's a fine version of things. And then you just say, she was punished for her sin. She couldn't resist the temptation of idolatry, and then ultimately she died. But I think you could just as easily say, maybe there's something more complicated here. Maybe it's, we might easily find ourselves in situations where there are things that we are struggling with the question of whether we should do them because they seem to have merit. They seem to also maybe be problematic in some way. And depending on what kind of a dire situation we're in, maybe we feel our hand is forced, right? The halacha is that if you think that your life is made in danger, it's a subjective judgment. I mean, you can, gather information to make a better decision, but ultimately, if you think your life is is endangered by something, then you can make decisions, or someone else's life is endangered. You can make decisions on the basis of pikuach nefesh for saving a life, even if others wouldn't necessarily agree with you. So in other words, you don't say to someone, well, you're afraid that if you don't do X, Y, or Z, that you're going to die. But I'm going to tell you that I have good information, and because I'm not worried about your dying, you can't violate Shabbat, even though you think it would save your life. If you think it would save your life, then you violate Shabbat, and there's no problem with that, because even if someone else might not have violated Shabbat because they wouldn't have considered it a risk to life. So there's an understanding of this issue in halacha that would say maybe certain things become permissible that are in some ways problematic under certain circumstances if you're very desperate. Now, avodah zarah is not something that's permitted for the sake of pikuach nefesh. At least, in the sense that we have these three categories of transgressions where we don't say ya'avo v'lo yareg. We say yareg v'lo ya'avo, like that you should be killed rather than to transgress. And those are avodah zarah, shpichut damim, and gilui arayot. In other words, worship of idols and bloodshed, like committing murder in order to avoid being murdered, and gilui arayot, which is different kinds of sexual immorality. So when we put all those things end to end, we can say is that Rachel maybe was doing something that she thought she needed. Maybe there's a way of saying she just wanted a tool to help her have a safer pregnancy, or a tool to help her to get where she needed to go, traveling on a dangerous road. But in the eyes of Lavan, her father, it wasn't just a tool. It had, it was connected to his idolatrous cult in some way. And it doesn't necessarily need to be that Rachel just thought, I want the luck of these gods. It might have been that, but we can give her the benefit of the doubt and say maybe that's not how she viewed it. But in any case, it's still a gray area and a problematic one. But I'm interested also in this question of how do we know from the Torah that the Teraphim have this kind of purpose, that they're for divination. And I think that this connects most directly to another shiur that we have in this series that is focused on comparing this journey of Yaakov back to Eretz Yisrael to the journey of Moshe back to Mitzrayim, where in both cases you have a man and his wife and children who leave his father-in-law's house to return to the man's land of birth. And on the way, they're going to meet with his brother. And also on the way, he's going to have some mysterious, dangerous encounter at night, right? In the case of Moshe, they're leaving the house of Yitro, and he and Zipporah and their sons are going back to Mitzrayim, where he was born. And they're going to meet Aharon, his brother. And they also have this strange event at the Machon, at the sort of, maybe the hotel, would be the modern word, but some kind of inn, some kind of place to stay for the night perhaps, where it seems like HaKadosh Baruch Hu is trying to kill Moshe out of the blue, which makes no sense. And then Zipporah performs Brit Milah on her son, and that saves Moshe somehow. And it's all bound up with meeting Aaron, we argued, because the two appearances of the word Vayifgeshehu in the Torah are back to back in that section where he's meeting Aaron, Vayifgeshehu, and also it's that Hashem tries to kill him. Vayifgeshehu Hashem Vayivakesh Hamito, that Hashem met him and tried to kill him. So on that basis, we're saying that somehow the meeting of Aaron has a sort of connection to danger, even though it's the case that it's hard for us to imagine that Aaron would actually try to kill him or be really connected with the danger to him. But the Vayifgeshehu seems to connect these two events somehow, that he meets Aharon, and he also, like right beforehand, is met by Hashem and somehow is in danger. So it came to pass on the way in the inn that the Lord met him and sought to kill him. So what does that mean? Unclear, but when we read it against what's going on with Yaakov, it makes sense, because Yaakov is worried about Esav trying to kill him. And he does have this dangerous encounter at night where he wrestles with someone. And that corresponds seemingly to this event where Moshe is somehow kind of struggling for his life also, perhaps at night. in the middle of this journey. So we lay those two stories end to end, and we start to be able to see different parallels and connections, right? Aside from what we already described with father-in-law and daughter and sons, and the man going back to the land of his birth, there's a dangerous encounter at night with some kind of struggle. There's the fact that they're going to meet the brother. But then you can also say, okay, there's blood, right? Because in one case, and not just blood, but blood connected with reproductive biology. Because in one case, it's Rachel talking about how she is menstruating, and that's how she's hiding the Teraphim. And in the other case, it's the blood of the circumcision that Tzipporah explicitly talks about when she performs the circumcision at this moment where Moshe is saved. So there is a set of parallels that we can draw between those two passages that make us think that we really should be able to kind of line up more bits if we just look for them. And I think one thing that's very interesting to then ask is, okay, so where are the Teraphim in the story with Moshe, right? Because if so much of this is diametrically lined up, then Rachel brought into the story, an object of power and divination from the house of her father. So there was something acquired in the house of the father-in-law, or in the house of the wife's father, that gets brought on the journey, and then somehow is connected with the events that are a problem, for the man, like the sort of either the wrestling or the danger to Moshe's life, and then sort of carry forward into the rest of where things lead. So where would be the Teraphim in that case? So I think what we want to argue is that the Teraphim in Moshe's story is the mateh, is the staff. That's the thing that Moshe acquires while he's dwelling in the household of his father-in-law. And at first it sounds like, it's true, it's an object that he acquires there, but how do we know that has to do with the Teraphim? Like, how do we make those things line up? And there, you have to bring in a few other passages and a few other connections, but you start to be able to make it work quite well, I think. First of all, what is the word for divination? The word for divination is nichush. Okay, so the word for serpent is nahash. The word for divination is nichush. It is nun het shin. They're not in principle related, although obviously serpents are kind of connected with avodah zarah and divination. And so maybe you could say they actually are more directly etymologically connected. But in any case, if you're going to talk about, there is no divination in Jacob, that's a pasuk in the Torah, lo nahash b'Yaakov, that's what Bilam says. So nahash or nihush, we're talking about divination, augury. It's also the case that the staff of Moshe is thrown on the ground, right? And it's a staff, but then he throws it on the ground, and then it becomes this unpredictable animal, which sounds like kind of rolling a die, right? That you may, you have a stick, and if you're holding the stick is totally predictable. But if you kind of spin the stick and throw it, exactly how it lands becomes something that you don't control and that it's unpredictable to you. And as a result, you have to kind of wait and see what happens. And then maybe it's assigned to you if you want to make it that. And that is how divination in one form or another often work, throwing bones, reading entrails, whatever. It's about unpredictability and giving an interpretation to the result of some unpredictable process. So the way Moshe is taught about the staff by HaKadosh Baruch Hu is throw it on the ground, and it's a nachash, pick it back up, and it's a stick. So there's this sense of once it's, you throw bones, now you're doing something that's kind of casting lots, and there's a probabilistic aspect. And that may be part of the sign that he's supposed to bring to Bnei Israel. Like it may be that it's not so much that it's a nahash, it's that it's kind of the probability stick. It's a stick that represents the idea of that Hashem decides what happens and improbable things can happen. That certainly is the rest of the story of what happens with that stick, right? So there's that. Then there's the question of, all right, where do we hear about reference to this idea of nihush, or, being an augurer? So actually we hear it first from Lavan. Vayomer Lavan, im namatzati hen ba'inecha, nihashti, vayivarecheni Adonai biglalecha. And Lavan said to Yaakov, I beg you, if I found favor in your eyes, remain, for I have learned by experience that the Lord has blessed me for your sake. So that's talking about, when they're setting Yaakov's wages at the beginning of the story. But the point is, Lavan talks about himself as he is minahesh, he is some kind of diviner of things, an augurer of things. And that's especially interesting because that stays in the family. That goes down from Lavan through Rachel to her son Yosef. How is that the case? Well, because when Yosef is doing this whole thing with framing his younger brother Binyamin, when the brothers are leaving Mitzrayim, and he puts his geviyah, his silver cup, in the sack of Binyamin, and then has them leave the city, and then he sends his guards to chase them. He has this exchange where he specifically says that, well, don't you know that my master uses this cup for divination? Halo ze asher yishteh adoni bo, vehu nahesh yinahesh bo, hareothem asher asithem. So it's sort of like, why would you steal this cup? Don't you know that my master uses this cup for, occult practices that allow him to see the future? So Yosef somehow is explicitly describing himself as practicing divination. Now, whether that's true or not, whether it's just part of his subterfuge, in any case, we're associating the cup with divination. And Yosef with divination, who is descended from Rachel, who is descended from Lavan. And not only that, it gets even more intricate, because what is the situation with this cup? Oh, it's someone being accused of stealing something from a household that they're leaving. And then everyone comes and there's this, declaration, someone stole this thing. And then, Judah steps up and says, no, of course, none of us stole it, and let anyone who stole it be put to death or become someone's slave. I think initially maybe he says be put to death. And then, or let's see, is it becoming slaves even initially? Let's see. Asher yimatzeh ito me'avadecha v'met v'gam anachnu nihiyeh la'adoni le'avadim. If any of your servants is found to have it, let him die, and we also will become my Lord's slaves. So that's what Judah starts out with as his offer. And then, Yosef says, no, it's fine. I'll just keep Binyamin as a slave and you guys can go. But the point is that thing of saying, we don't have this thing, but if you find it, of course, you should kill the person you find it with. That's what Yaakov does with Rachel and the Teraphim. So it's a repetition of that element with a son of Rachel. And not only that, but this is the cup that's used for divination, right? So it's a tool of divination that this is being said about, just like it was being said about the Teraphim when the Teraphim were stolen. And it gets even more intricate because this is happening in between Canaan and Mitzrayim. And actually, this is the second time that the brothers have gone out of Mitzrayim and then looked in their sacks on the way in between Mitzrayim and Canaan. And actually, the first time they do it, Yosef had put all their money back in their sacks. So that's why it's mentioned. It says, "Vayiftach hayhad et sako latet mispo lehamoro bamalon vayar et kaspo uhinehu befi am tahto." And as one of them opened his sack to give his ass provender in the inn, he saw his money, for behold, it was in his sack's mouth. Okay, so they're in the inn. They're in Bamalon. Bamalon is a phrase that appears twice in Chumash, here and when Moshe and Tzipporah are having their event going towards Mitzrayim. So because this is one of two times that the brothers are leaving Mitzrayim with food, you associate Bamalon with that stopping in the middle of that journey. And so there's a Bamalon, there's an object that is used to practice divination, that going in one direction out of Mitzrayim, someone is saying, oh, if this object that's stolen is found, then let the person who stole it be killed, like with the Teraphim, and it's a son of Rachel, who is ended up getting framed in this case. Or when you're going in the other direction, Bamalon down to Mitzrayim, then, we're talking about the Malon being this stopping point in between Mitzrayim and Canaan, and that parallels this moment where the brothers are leaving and they're also stopping in the Malon. So you weave it all together and you say, oh, so from the Yosef, Rachel, Lavan, Binyamin, Yaakov kind of matrix, I'm getting strongly that the stolen object is for divination, or at least also maybe that means the object taken from the house of the father-in-law is for divination. And what is the word for divination? It's nihush. And you go over to Moshe, and what object was taken from the house of the father-in-law? It was a staff that turns into a nahash, into a serpent. And so it all just clicks. It fits side by side. And what you come up with is, oh, well, I look at all these different passages together, actually 4 different passages side by side. And between Malon and Nahash, Nihush, and stealing things and saying someone should be killed if the thing that they've stolen is found, and the lineage of Lavan down through Yosef and Binyamin, and Lavan saying that he practices divination, Nihush, and Yosef saying he practices divination. We're saying that in the story of Moshe and Tzipporah, the staff that you throw on the ground, like you're throwing bones, like you're, gonna roll a dice, or roll the dice, that staff is the Teraphim in that story. It's the thing that corresponds to the Teraphim. And from all of that helps us to realize that the Teraphim are a tool of divination, right? That it didn't say in the story of Rachel this was a tool of divination, but we get it because all the arrows outside in these other passages are pointing at that. It's about nihush, it's about probability and uncertainty. And that helps you to explain Rachel's behavior and understand it a little bit better. The question is, if you're going on a journey, do you need the GPS, so to speak, or not? Or do you need the tool for better decision-making or not? How does the tool for decision-making work? Is it about relying on something as mundane and practical as a bucket handle? Or is it about putting your confidence in the power of something that maybe you want to kind of use to stack the deck for yourself a little bit? Like, whatever Hashem wants, I'll try to see if I can get a little bit of extra luck on the side, right? That's the question of how problematic is the behavior of Rachel. And what's so clear from this comparison is that we should not rush to judge her, because Moshe, under slightly different circumstances that are extremely parallel, is being commanded by Hashem to take with him to Mitzrayim a thing that is kind of like the Teraphim. It's like his staff that he uses for all these things that look like divination and sorcery at the behest of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in order to liberate Bnei Yisrael from Mitzrayim. So the Torah is really showing you that very subtle differences in details can lead to the Teraphim on the one hand, which is, oh, that's bad, Rachel is stealing false idols, and why does she need to do that? And we think very badly of her for doing it. And then you go over to Moshe, and it's like, Moshe with his staff, he's being sent to free the slaves, and he's doing what Hashem told him to do. And even the Midrash that's told about this event with Moshe, interestingly, emphasizes the serpent aspect, right? Because what it's saying is, that why is it that Tzipporah performed Brit Milah? Because when Moshe was at the Machon, and then he had this dangerous experience. The dangerous experience was a serpent came and swallowed him, head down to his waist, but couldn't go past the side of his Brit Milah. And then it tried swallowing him from his feet, and it couldn't go past the side of the Brit Milah. And so that's how she knew that the Brit Milah was the thing that she needed to do. So it brings a serpent into the story, and it talks about, kind of sorcery. The serpent swallowing is what happens when we go to Mitzrayim with the staff of Aaron. It's also involving Aaron in that midrash as a result. But the point is that it's all bound up in, what is your attitude about what you're doing? Are you representing Hashem and you're doing that clearly? Or maybe, if you're not circumcising your children anymore, you're kind of planning to go back and become part of the Egyptian court. Maybe you're planning to make your son, who's not circumcised, a prince in Egypt. That if that's the case, then maybe you are kind of hoping that this is a sorcerer's staff and you have the wrong attitude about it and you're going to convey the wrong attitude about it. And as a result, you don't deserve the success. And so Kadosh Baruch Hu is just going to sink you, right? So the dynamic is clearly different at some level in the story of Moshe than it is with Rachel. But at the end of the day, both of these situations are very marginal because we're dealing with something that is very in danger of being construed as idolatry and augury and all these things that are a problem, whether it's what Moshe is doing or whether it's what Rachel is doing. And so we both can maybe think better of Rachel and say, maybe Rachel had the right intentions, or she thought, and she sort of walked over the line, but only just. And she was just trying to bring a tool on the one hand, something that seemed to have clear power that was useful. And she didn't want to kind of believe in the gods. She wanted to use the tool, versus going over to Moshe and you say, okay, he's doing the right thing. He's doing what Hashem said. But if he starts to have the wrong attitude at all about how he's doing it and why he's doing it, then it's not the right thing anymore. And then HaKadosh Baruch Hu will say, okay, if you're going to just go be an idolater and a sorcerer, then I don't need you. So both of these passages I think are really illuminating each other. And, we get more by seeing the background with Yosef and Binyamin as well. And all that sets us up to say, okay, now we know what the Teraphim are at some level. Like we understand why it is, perhaps, that Yechezkel Navi finds it so natural to say Teraphim are for making a good decision about which road to take. Because the Torah itself, the Chumash, the 5 books of Moses, are telling us it's about divination and probability and, standing at a crossroads. Like a fork in the road is all about probability, right? It's like, which path am I going to take? Should I flip a coin? That kind of thing. So I think that may be a good place to close things up now, except to kind of as a teaser go for like where are we going to head in the second shiur? Because we also want to talk about Gid Nashe, this sort of strange thing of we don't eat this particular nerve, and what could that possibly have to do with what we've been talking about? Well, to remind, the wrestling that Yaakov engages in is part of the story where Rachel is leaving with the Teraphim, and then they're going to go to Canaan, and eventually she dies on the road to Bethlehem, giving birth to Binyamin. So this thing of a strange figure in the night that may be connected somehow with the fact that he's about to meet his brother, trying to kill him or wrestling with him, producing danger, that parallels this crisis of Moshe at the Machon, where he's staying in the night and Tzipora is performing the Brit Milah. But now we have to ask, what is this thing with, and that's why we don't eat this nerve. What could that possibly have to do with what we just said about the Teraphim, right? We just said the Teraphim are about divination, and they're about decision-making, about where to go. And so what I'll want to argue the next time we do a shiur is that those two themes are connected, that the Gid Nashe, the way to understand the Gid Nashe is to understand the prohibitions involving divination in the Torah, and also crucially the prohibitions of eating blood. So we will pick that up next time. Kol Tuv.